Did some of sci-fi's biggest box office disasters fail because audiences rejected them? Or because studios quietly destroyed them first? Behind these flops are missing cuts, fired directors, panic reshoots, fake happy endings, and executives trying to fix movies they barely understood. Some became cult legends, others never recovered. But the most shocking part is how many of these films were not ruined on screen. They were ruined in the boardroom. The Black Hole, 1979. Disney wanted its own Star Wars moment, but what it had was something stranger, darker, and much harder to sell. The Black Hole was not just a space adventure. Underneath the robots, laser guns, and cosmic spectacle, it carried the mood of a gothic nightmare. A mysterious spacecraft sits near a collapsing star. A mad commander rules like a space-age Dracula, and the story slowly drifts toward obsession, death, and something almost spiritual. But Disney, still known mainly as the family-friendly kingdom, seemed unsure how far it could push that darkness. The studio wanted a grand science fiction event that could compete with the new blockbuster era, yet it also needed something safe enough for its traditional audience. That tension is all over the final film. One scene feels eerie and philosophical. The next feels like a toy commercial space chase. The result was expensive, ambitious, and oddly beautiful, but also confused about whether it wanted to terrify children or entertain them. At the box office, it underperformed against expectations, and its reputation became trapped between cult curiosity and failed blockbuster. The sad irony? If Disney had trusted the darker vision, The Black Hole might have become a haunting sci-fi classic instead of a fascinating almost masterpiece. John Carter, 2012. A movie can survive monsters, alien kingdoms, and impossible battles, but it cannot survive a studio that does not know how to sell it. John Carter had everything Hollywood usually claims to want: a legendary source, huge world-building, sweeping romance, Civil War trauma, Martian politics, and blockbuster scale. But Disney's handling turned a potentially grand sci-fi adventure into one of the most infamous financial disasters of the modern era. The biggest wound came before many viewers even knew what the film was. By dropping "Of Mars" from the title, the marketing stripped away the very sense of pulp wonder that made the story special. Posters looked vague. Trailers struggled to explain the world. Instead of selling mystery, danger, and classic adventure, the campaign made the film look like a generic, effects-heavy gamble. Behind the scenes, the movie was also pressured to fit a modern blockbuster mold while carrying a century-old mythology most audiences did not recognize. That confusion became fatal. John Carter did not just flop, it became a warning sign in Hollywood boardrooms. But watch it today, and the tragedy is obvious. The failure was not a lack of imagination. It was a failure of belief, branding, and studio confidence. The Cloverfield Paradox, 2018. This is what happens when a movie is not born into a franchise. It gets surgically attached to one after the fact. The Cloverfield Paradox began life as a separate sci-fi thriller called God Particle, built around astronauts, a particle accelerator, and a reality-bending disaster in orbit. On paper, that premise had real tension. Trapped scientists, broken physics, and the terrifying idea that one experiment could tear open the universe. But as production shifted, the film was reshaped into another piece of the Cloverfield brand, and that decision became its biggest problem. Instead of feeling like a clean, frightening space mystery, it had to carry the weight of franchise clues, monster mythology, and connections that never felt fully organic. The result was a film caught between two identities. It wanted to be a claustrophobic, cosmic thriller, but it also had to explain why it belonged in a series famous for earthbound chaos and viral mystery. Then came the final blow. Instead of a confident theatrical release, Paramount sold it to Netflix, where it appeared suddenly after the Super Bowl. That move created buzz, but also made the film feel like a studio had lost faith. Its real horror was not the experiment, it was the retrofit. The New Mutants, 2020. Some movies flop on opening weekend. The New Mutants looked haunted long before it even reached theaters. Originally pitched as a darker, more horror-driven spin on the X-Men universe, it had a genuinely sharp hook. Young mutants trapped in a facility, fearing their powers, their pasts, and whatever was stalking them from the shadows. That could have been a fresh break from the glossy superhero formula. But the film became trapped inside corporate chaos. Fox delayed it repeatedly. Reshoot rumors followed it everywhere. Then Disney's purchase of Fox left the project stranded between two eras of Marvel branding. By the time audiences finally saw it, the movie felt less like a bold new beginning and more like the last item pulled from an abandoned shelf. The pandemic made the release even worse, crushing its chance to build momentum in theaters. What makes the failure frustrating is that the ingredients were not worthless. Anya Taylor-Joy, Maisie Williams, and the asylum horror concept gave it a personality most superhero movies did not have. But constant delays drained the mystery, and studio uncertainty weakened the identity. The New Mutants did not simply arrive late, it arrived already defeated. In the end, the scariest thing in the film was how long it had been buried. Chaos Walking, 2021. A film about thoughts everyone can hear somehow became a movie with no clear voice of its own. Chaos Walking had a fascinating sci-fi idea. On a distant planet, men's thoughts are exposed through a phenomenon called noise, turning privacy into a battlefield and fear into something visible. With Tom Holland and Daisy Ridley leading the cast, the project should have had serious young adult franchise potential. But the production became a warning sign for what happens when a studio loses faith in a complicated premise. Test screenings reportedly went badly, the film was delayed, and expensive reshoots followed. The problem was not just polish, it was identity. The story needed atmosphere, tension, and psychological danger, but the final cut often feels like it is rushing through its own best ideas. The noise should have been disturbing, intimate, and impossible to escape. Instead, it becomes visually busy and emotionally uneven. By the time the film reached theaters, the delays had cooled public interest, the budget had ballooned, and the marketing could not make the concept feel urgent. Chaos Walking bombed hard, but the real disappointment is deeper. Buried inside the mess was a smart, strange sci-fi thriller trying to survive a studio panic attack. Solo, a Star Wars story, 2018. Even Star Wars can bleed when a studio tries to rebuild the ship while it is already flying. Solo was supposed to be a fun origin story for Han Solo, showing how a young smuggler found his swagger, his ship, his best friend, and his legend. But behind the scenes, the movie became one of the most dramatic production shakeups in blockbuster history. Original directors Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were removed deep into filming after creative clashes over tone and improvisation. Ron Howard was brought in to steady the project, reshoot large portions, and reshape the film into something safer and more traditional. The result was not a disaster on screen, but it carried the scars of compromise. You can feel two possible movies fighting inside it, one loose, weird, and rebellious, the other polished, controlled, and carefully branded. For a film about the galaxy's greatest rule breaker, that is painfully ironic. Then came the release strategy. Arriving only months after The Last Jedi, Solo faced franchise fatigue, mixed audience mood, and enormous financial expectations. It underperformed badly for Star Wars. The cruel twist is that Solo is not terrible. It is just too cautious for a character who was never meant to play safe. Fantastic Four, 2015. Some superhero films collapse because the audience rejects them. This one looked like it was fighting itself from the first frame. Fantastic Four had the ingredients for a bold sci-fi body horror reinvention. Young geniuses, unstable science, a dangerous interdimensional experiment, and powers that should have felt terrifying before they felt heroic. Director Josh Trank seemed interested in something darker and more grounded, closer to a tragic science experiment than a shiny comic book adventure. But the final film tells another story. After studio pressure, heavy reshoots, and a famously troubled production, Fantastic Four arrived looking stitched together from two different visions. The early scenes are slow, moody, and almost clinical. Then, the ending suddenly jumps into a rushed, generic battle that feels disconnected from everything before it. Even the characters seem unfinished, as if their emotional arcs were cut before they could breathe. Audiences noticed immediately. Critics were brutal, fans were angry, and the film became a symbol of what happens when a studio panics halfway through a creative experiment. The cruel part is that the core idea was not hopeless. A darker Fantastic Four could have been fascinating. Instead, the movie became its own origin story of failure. Four heroes transformed, then trapped inside a film that never fully knew what it wanted to be. The Invasion, 2007. The scariest thing about The Invasion was not the alien takeover. It was the feeling that the movie had been taken over too. Based on the classic Body Snatchers idea, this film had a powerful modern hook. A mysterious infection spreads through society, replacing human emotion with cold obedience. With Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig leading the cast, it could have been a sleek, paranoid sci-fi thriller about conformity, fear, and losing your identity in plain sight. But the studio reportedly disliked the original direction and ordered major changes. New writing, reshoots, and action-heavy adjustments followed, turning what might have been a slow-burn psychological nightmare into a confused hybrid. You can feel the tension between two movies. One wants to be quiet, eerie, and unsettling. The other wants chases, explosions, and a more conventional blockbuster rhythm. That split drains the suspense. Instead of building dread, the film keeps interrupting itself, as if nervous executives kept asking, "Can we make this faster?" The result was a box office disappointment and a forgettable entry in a story tradition that usually thrives on atmosphere. The tragedy is simple. Body Snatchers stories work best when they whisper. The Invasion was forced to shout and somehow became less frightening. Aeon Flux, 2005. A strange, stylish sci-fi world was hiding inside Aeon Flux, but the final cut barely lets it breathe. The original animated series was weird, sensual, philosophical, and visually daring, exactly the kind of material that needed confidence, not fear. Karen Kusama's film had the chance to become a sleek dystopian thriller about control, memory, rebellion, and identity. Charlize Theron gave it star power, the costumes had sharp futuristic beauty, and the world of Brenya could have felt like a living nightmare wrapped in elegance. But the studio reportedly stepped in heavily during editing, reshaping the movie and stripping away parts of its tone and complexity. What remained was glossy but strangely hollow. The film moves quickly, but not always clearly. Characters mention big ideas, yet the emotional weight often feels missing. Action scenes arrive before the world has fully explained why they matter. At the box office, audiences did not connect, and critics treated it like another failed video game-looking sci-fi experiment, even though its source was far more unusual than that. The disappointment is not that Aeon Flux was too weird. The disappointment is that it may not have been allowed to be weird enough. A cult object was turned into a cautious product, and caution killed the spark. Babylon AD, 2008. When the director of a movie publicly attacks his own film, you know the damage happened long before opening weekend. Babylon AD had the raw material for a gritty cyberpunk road movie, a mercenary escorting a mysterious young woman across a broken future surrounded by war zones, corporate power, religious manipulation, and genetic secrets. With Vin Diesel in the lead and Matthew Kassovitz behind the camera, it could have become a dirty, violent, philosophical sci-fi thriller with real bite. Instead, the production became infamous for conflict. Kassovitz later criticized the studio's handling, saying the film had been damaged by interference, cuts, and a lack of support for the story's bigger ideas. Watching the final version, that frustration makes sense. Babylon AD has atmosphere, locations, and flashes of a stronger movie, but it keeps skipping emotional steps. The plot feels chopped. The mythology feels half-explained. The ending lands with the exhaustion of a film trying to escape its own production problems. Audiences stayed away, critics dismissed it, and the movie quickly became a cautionary tale. But there is something fascinating in the wreckage. Babylon AD does not feel like a movie with no vision. It feels like a movie whose vision was buried under corporate noise, leaving only sparks where the fire should have been. Mimic, 1997. Before Guillermo del Toro became a beloved master of monsters, Hollywood gave him a creature feature that nearly broke his spirit. Mimic had a brilliant horror sci-fi premise. Scientists create a genetically engineered insect to stop a disease, only for that creation to evolve into something far more dangerous beneath New York City. It was exactly the kind of story Del Toro could have turned into a tragic monster fable. Creepy, textured, emotional, and full of strange beauty. But the production became a painful battle. Del Toro clashed with the Weinsteins over tone, editing, and creative control, and he later spoke openly about how miserable the experience was. The final film still has moments of atmosphere, damp tunnels, insect shadows, religious imagery, and the sense that humanity's solution has become a punishment. But it also feels compromised, pushed toward a more standard monster movie shape when it wanted to be something richer. The box office was modest, the response was mixed, and Del Toro moved on carrying the scars of studio control. Yet Mimic remains interesting because you can still see his fingerprints under the interference. The creature is not just a bug, it is a warning. When studios silence a filmmaker's instincts, even the monsters lose part of their soul. Alien 3, 1992. A sequel to Aliens should have felt like a victory lap, but Alien 3 arrived like a funeral before the movie even began. After the explosive success of James Cameron's film, audiences expected more action, more mythology, and maybe a heroic continuation for Ripley, Newt, and Hicks. Instead, the film opened by killing that hope almost immediately, trapping Ripley inside a bleak prison colony where faith, violence, disease, and death hang in the air like smoke. On paper, that darkness could have been powerful. The problem was how the movie got there. Fox changed creative directions repeatedly, cycled through scripts, and pushed production forward before the story was fully ready. David Fincher, making his feature debut, was forced to fight a studio machine that kept rewriting, reshaping, and second-guessing the film while cameras were rolling. You can feel that pressure in the final cut. There are haunting images, sharp ideas, and a brutal atmosphere, but the movie often feels wounded, as if its bones were broken during production and never set correctly. Fans were divided, critics were disappointed, and the box office could not match the expectations left by Aliens. The tragedy is not that Alien 3 was dark. The tragedy is that its darkness needed control, and the studio chaos made it feel like punishment instead of prophecy. Supernova 2000. Some flops are messy. Supernova feels like a distress signal from a movie that was abandoned in deep space. It began as a dark sci-fi thriller with a dangerous premise. A medical rescue ship answers a call, brings aboard a mysterious survivor, and slowly discovers that something unstable, seductive, and possibly apocalyptic has entered the crew's lives. That should have created a claustrophobic nightmare, full of paranoia, strange science, and body-level fear. But behind the scenes, the production became nearly as chaotic as the story. Director Walter Hill's version reportedly failed to satisfy MGM. The film was taken away, reshoots followed, and the editing process became a patchwork of different hands trying to rescue a movie that no longer had one clear pulse. Even Francis Ford Coppola was later brought in to help rework it, which tells you how desperate things had become. The final film is not simply bad in a normal way. It feels strangely incomplete. Characters change direction without enough emotional buildup. The threat never becomes as terrifying as it should. Big ideas appear, then vanish. When it finally hit theaters, audiences ignored it, and the box office collapse was severe. Yet Supernova remains fascinating because somewhere inside the wreckage is a lean, nasty space thriller. The studio did not save it. The studio scattered it across the stars. Dune, 1984. David Lynch was handed one of science fiction's richest worlds, then forced to compress an empire into a movie that could barely breathe. Dune was never going to be easy. Frank Herbert's novel had politics, religion, prophecy, ecology, family betrayal, spice addiction, desert warfare, and messianic danger layered into a universe that needed patience. Lynch brought atmosphere, grotesque beauty, and a strange dreamlike intensity that could have made the film unforgettable in a completely different way from normal studio sci-fi. But Universal wanted a commercially manageable epic, not a dense, sprawling vision that might overwhelm audiences. The film was cut down heavily, and the missing complexity had to be patched with narration, exposition, and rushed explanation. That is why Dune often feels both enormous and cramped at the same time. The costumes, sets, worms, and images suggest a vast, mythic universe, but the storytelling keeps sprinting through ideas that should have landed with weight. Viewers were confused, critics were divided, and the box office failed to justify the ambition. Lynch later distanced himself from the experience, and the film became one of cinema's most famous compromised epics. But its failure is also why people still talk about it. Dune did not flop because it had no imagination. It flopped because too much imagination was forced through too small a studio-shaped door. Blade Runner, 1982. The most painful studio interference stories are the ones where history later proves the executives wrong. Blade Runner is now treated like sacred sci-fi cinema, but when it first reached audiences, it was not presented with the confidence it deserved. Ridley Scott had created a rain-soaked future full of neon decay, corporate power, artificial humans, and moral uncertainty. It was slow, hypnotic, and deeply uncomfortable because it asked a question bigger than its detective plot. If a manufactured being can fear death, love life, and suffer, what makes it less human than us? The studio worried viewers would find it confusing and too bleak. So the theatrical version was altered with a more explanatory voiceover, a brighter ending, and changes that softened the film's ambiguity. Instead of trusting the audience to sit inside the mystery, the film was pushed towards something easier to digest. But Blade Runner was never meant to be easy. It was meant to haunt. At the box office, it underperformed, partly swallowed by bigger crowd-pleasing films of the era. Then, over time, alternate cuts revealed the movie's true power, and its reputation transformed completely. That is the ultimate twist. The version audiences rejected was the compromised one. The masterpiece was there all along, waiting for the studio fingerprints to fade. So the next time someone calls a sci-fi flop bad, ask one question: bad idea or bad studio rescue mission? These films were not just box office failures. They were battles between imagination and control. Some survived as cult legends. Others stayed buried. But everyone proves the same thing. Sometimes the real monster is behind the camera.